The last time I saw my brother Norman, alive and standing on his own 2 feet, he was laughing at something stupid I said at his granddaughter's birthday party in Kelowna. That was 3 years ago. When I saw him again, he was sitting in a hospital bed at Foothills Medical Center in Calgary. His left eye swollen shut, 3 ribs cracked, and a look in his face I had never seen in 64 years of knowing him. Not pain. Worse than pain. Shame. I am not a gentleman. I spent 22 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, infantry, 2 tours in Bosnia, 1 in Afghanistan. I came home with a bad knee, a short fuse, and the particular kind of patience that only soldiers understand, the kind where you sit completely still and wait for exactly the right moment. My wife Diane always said I had 2 speeds, dead calm and a freight train. She was right about that. Norman is my twin brother. We are identical, or we were, before life carved different lines into our faces. He went into finance, built a small empire managing investment portfolios out of Calgary, retired comfortable. I went into the Army. We took different roads, but we were always close, the way twins are close. A kind of understanding that doesn't need phone calls to stay alive. When the hospital called me in Edmonton, I drove down in under 3 hours. The nurse who met me in the hallway thought I was Norman for a second and actually stepped back. I did not have time to find that funny. My brother had fallen. That was the official story. He had fallen down the stairs at his own house, a beautiful house in Mount Royal, the kind of neighborhood where people have heated driveways and never fall downstairs. I sat beside his bed and looked at the bruising on his forearm and the particular angle of the bruising on his ribs, and I knew the way you know things when you have spent years studying how the human body gets damaged, that those injuries did not come from stairs. "Who did this to you, Norman?" I said. I did not ask it like a question. He turned his face toward the window. "Talk to me," I said. "Right now. Talk to me." It came out in pieces over the next hour. His son-in-law, a man named Callum, had been living in Norman's house for 2 years. Norman's daughter Renee had married him 4 years ago. A fast courtship, a man with easy charm and an expensive watch and a handshake that somehow always felt like it was taking something from you. When Norman's health started declining, a heart condition, medications that needed managing, some early memory trouble that made him occasionally confused about dates and documents, Callum had stepped in to help. That was how it started. Callum would handle the bills. Callum would manage the medication schedule. Callum would drive him to appointments. Callum would take care of things. Within 18 months, Callum's name was on the joint account that handled household expenses. Norman's investment accounts had been consolidated, restructured, moved to a new advisor, a friend of Callum's. The house had been refinanced to access equity for what Callum described as a business opportunity Norman had supposedly enthusiastically endorsed. Norman could not clearly remember endorsing it, but the paperwork had his signature and his notarized signature, and Callum had explained it all very patiently. The medication was the part that made my hands go still. Norman's cardiologist had prescribed a specific daily medication for his arrhythmia. It was not expensive, maybe $80 a month at Shoppers Drug Mart, covered partially by his extended benefits from his old firm. But Callum controlled the benefits card. Callum picked up the prescription, and when Norman said something Callum did not like, asked a question about the finances, mentioned talking to his old accountant, suggested maybe Renee should look at the investment statements, Callum would forget to pick up the medication, would leave it 1 day, 2 days, would mention, very quietly, how much he was doing for Norman, how hard it was, how Renee was exhausted, how ungrateful it felt. A man in his late 60s with a heart condition and some memory confusion, living in his own house, sitting at his own kitchen table, being made to feel like a burden and a problem and someone who had better stay quiet and stay grateful. I sat in that hospital room for a long time after Norman stopped talking. The window looked out onto a gray February sky over Calgary, and I watched 2 pigeons on the ledge. And I breathed the way they teach you to breathe when you are about to do something that requires your hands to be steady. "Where is Renee?" I said. Norman was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't know everything. She doesn't want to know everything." "And Callum?" "At the house. He's managing things while I'm here." I nodded slowly. I thought about what managing things meant in that context, and I felt something settle in my chest like a key turning a lock. We are identical twins. Norman is 3 minutes older and has been quietly smug about it his entire life. Same height, 6'1". Same gray hair, though mine is cut short. Military habit I never shook. Different builds. I have kept myself in shape. Norman let himself go soft after retirement. But nothing that clothing and posture could not adjust. We had switched places as children, as teenagers, twice in university that I know of. It was easy when we were young, and I had no reason to believe it would be impossible now. I called my daughter back in Edmonton, told her I would be gone a few weeks, asked her to check on Diane's garden. Diane passed 4 years ago, but I keep the garden going. Then I sat down across from Norman and laid out what I was thinking. He told me I was out of my mind. I told him I had been out of my mind for 30 years, and it had worked out reasonably well. He told me Callum was not a man to underestimate. I told him I was not a man who underestimated people. It took 2 days. We went over everything. Norman's medications, the dosage and schedule, his relationship with his cardiologist, Dr. Patel, who had known Norman for 11 years and who I would need to avoid if at all possible. The PIN for the household account. The alarm code for the house. The name of his neighbor, Ed, who liked to chat over the back fence every Saturday morning and who Norman described as a genuinely decent man who had never warmed to Callum. The name of the cat. A large orange tabby named Biscuit who trusted Norman completely and regarded strangers with specific contempt. The morning Norman was transferred to a rehab facility in Airdrie for a few weeks of recovery, I drove to Mount Royal in Norman's car, parked in Norman's driveway, and walked into Norman's house with Norman's keys and Norman's reading glasses folded in the breast pocket of Norman's cardigan. Callum was in the kitchen when I came in. He was younger than I expected. Late 30s, good-looking in a way that had clearly worked well for him his entire life. The kind of man who moved through rooms with the quiet confidence of someone who had never genuinely been challenged. He was making coffee in one of those expensive pour-over setups, and he looked up when I came in. "Feeling better," he said. Not a question, really. "Bit," I said. I made my voice softer than my own, a little slower. Norman has always been the quieter of us. Just wanted to be home. Callum nodded. He poured himself his coffee and said the doctor had called and left a message. He'd handle it. I should rest. I looked at him across the kitchen island. I looked at the way he turned back to his phone without asking how the hospital had been, without asking what the doctors had said, without asking anything at all. I looked at this man standing in my brother's kitchen, pouring his coffee in my brother's cups. And I breathed very slowly and I said I thought I would lie down for a bit. Those first few days were about watching. That is something the military teaches you before it teaches you anything else. You watch before you move. You watch until you know the patterns and the pressure points and the things a person thinks nobody is noticing. Callum was on his phone constantly. Not in obvious ways, not waving it around, but always there. Always a text. Always a quiet call taken in the back hallway. He had a habit of going to the study in the evenings and closing the door. Norman's study, with Norman's desk and Norman's filing cabinets, which I found one afternoon when Callum was out, contained very little of Norman's original financial paperwork. What was there were statements from an investment firm I did not recognize, correspondence with a lawyer whose letterhead I photographed carefully with my phone, and a folder that contained what appeared to be early drafts of documents related to a power of attorney arrangement that had not, as far as Norman knew, been finalized. I called Norman from a burner phone I had picked up at a Walmart in Midnapore. We talked for 40 minutes. He cried once, briefly, and then got himself together the way our father had taught us to get ourselves together. By the end of the call, we had agreed on what needed to happen and roughly how long it would take. I did not need to manufacture conflict with Callum. He provided it reliably. The medication, first. He stretched the pickup. I watched him check the prescription bottle, calculate, decide that Norman could go 2 more days before it became urgent. I said nothing. I went to a different shopper's, 2 neighborhoods over, paid out of pocket, managed my own supply, but I let the bottle on the counter sit there, and I watched him watch it. The household account, second. He transferred a sum, not enormous, careful, the kind of amount that could be explained, into an account I did not recognize. I photographed the transaction screen on the laptop he had left open in the kitchen. He had no idea I had seen it. The third thing was Renee. I had not expected to feel complicated about Renee, but when she came over on a Sunday afternoon, and sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. I understood what Norman had meant. She did not want to know, not because she didn't love her father. I could see she did. It was in the way she looked at him, the way she reached over and touched his hand when he said something about being tired. But Callum was her husband, and she had married him, and admitting what he was would mean admitting something about herself, about her choices, about the years she had spent looking slightly away. Some people protect themselves by not looking. It is human, and I had seen it before, and I was not going to let it be the reason my brother's house and money ended up legally transferred to a 38-year-old con artist in a nice cardigan. I called her one evening when Callum was out. I told her I had found some documents I did not understand, and that I wanted her to look at them with me. I kept my voice gentle, which required effort. I said I was probably confused, probably missing something. Could she just come over and help me work through it? She came the next morning. I laid out what I had found. I did not editorialize. I put the papers on the table and I let her read. She was very quiet for a long time. "There might be an explanation," she said. "There might," I agreed. I kept my voice level. "I would like to hear it." She did not have one. I told her I needed a few more days. I asked her to say nothing to Callum, and I watched her face to see if she would, and I saw the moment something shifted in her. Fear, maybe. Or the particular clarity that comes when you have been not looking at something for a long time and suddenly you see it. "Okay," she said. Her voice was smaller than I expected. 2 days later, I called Norman's old accountant, a man named Fraser who had handled Norman's books for 15 years before Callum had managed him out of the picture. Fraser had not heard from Norman in over a year, and when I said I was Norman and that I wanted him back, his voice went warm with relief in a way that told me everything about how that separation had felt. We talked for an hour. He made calls. He flagged the investment account transfers. He contacted the original law firm who had done Norman's estate planning, not the new lawyer whose letterhead I had photographed. On a Thursday evening, Callum came home and found me sitting at the kitchen table with Fraser, and a woman from Norman's original law firm named Patricia, and a man from the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, who Fraser had been quietly in touch with for 3 days. Callum stood in the doorway for a long moment, and I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The rapid reassessment, the search for the angle, the confidence looking for solid ground and not finding it. "Norman," he said carefully, "what's going on?" I looked at him, and I let the voice go, and the posture, and the softness, and I straightened up in my chair the way I have been straightening up in chairs since 1985. "Norman's in Airdrie," I said. "Getting better." He says hello. I wish I had a better word for what happened to his face than collapse, but collapse is what it was. The RCMP officer asked Callum to sit down. Patricia began explaining, in a careful legal voice, the difference between a fraudulently obtained power of attorney and a legitimate one, and what the implications were for the account, transfers, and the refinancing documentation. Fraser opened his briefcase and laid out 3 years of reconstructed financial records with the quiet satisfaction of a man settling a long account. I got up and went to the kitchen and fed Biscuit, who had decided 2 weeks ago that I was acceptable. And I stood at my brother's kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, with the snow starting to thin at the edges, and thought about calling Diane's sister to ask about the garden, and waited for it to be over. Callum was charged. The process took months, the way these things do in Canada, carefully and with a great deal of paperwork. The power of attorney documents were found to be fraudulent. The investment transfers were reversed, were reversible and litigated where they were not. The refinancing was challenged on the basis of undue influence, a legal argument that Fraser's lawyer pursued with what I can only describe as genuine enthusiasm. Renee filed for separation in March. She came to see Norman in Airdrie the week after that Thursday evening, and she sat with him for 4 hours. And I do not know everything they said to each other because I took a long walk along the Bow River and let them have it. When I came back, her eyes were red and Norman's were too, and they were watching a bad game show on the television. And she had her hand over his, and that was enough. Norman came home to his house in Mount Royal in April. He is managing his own medication now. Has it delivered? The way he should have been doing from the beginning. Fraser is back handling his accounts. The cat sits on his lap in the evenings and Norman reads and sometimes calls me to tell me about something interesting he has read, and I tell him something equally interesting, and we talk for longer than we need to, and I do not mind that at all. My knee is worse for the weeks of sleeping in an unfamiliar bed, and I had a conversation with my own doctor about it that I found irritating. Small price. People ask me sometimes, when I tell parts of this story, whether I was angry, whether I wanted to do more than sit across a kitchen table with paperwork and let the system work. And honestly, I understand the question. There were moments in those 2 weeks, watching him calculate the medication timing, watching him move through Norman's house with the ease of a man who believed it was already his, when the freight train in me strained very hard against its brakes. But I spent 22 years learning that the most devastating thing you can do to a man who has spent years making himself small and careful is to take away the ground he built on and make him face what he actually is in a room full of witnesses, with nowhere to put his face. That was enough. That was more than enough. Norman is 67 years old, and he is sleeping in his own bed and making his own coffee and sitting in his own backyard when the weather permits. That is the whole story. That is what it was always about. I keep thinking about the moment Callum walked through that kitchen door and saw the table. Not me specifically. Not even the RCMP officer. Just the table, the papers spread out, the open briefcase, the faces of people he had spent 2 years carefully keeping away from my brother. I watched him look at it, and I watched the particular kind of confidence that had carried him through every room of that house drain out of his face all at once. And I thought, this is what happens when a man builds everything on the assumption that nobody is paying close enough attention. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about my brother, and he was wrong about me. What Callum did was not complicated. When you strip it back, he found a man whose health was slipping, whose daughter trusted him, whose old network had been quietly pushed to the edges. He made himself indispensable. He made Norman feel like a burden instead of a man in his own home. And then he started moving things, slowly, carefully, the way you move things when you are counting on nobody noticing until it is too late. It works, that approach, until it runs into someone who has spent a career noticing exactly what people do not want noticed. I have thought about what made the difference in the end, not the military background. Plenty of people with that background would have driven down to Calgary, had a very loud conversation, and accomplished nothing legally useful. What mattered was the patience to watch before acting, and the honesty to see the situation clearly without letting anger make the decisions. Norman needed documents, not a confrontation. He needed Fraser and Patricia and a financial crimes officer sitting at his kitchen table, not his brother putting a fist through something, knowing the difference, knowing what the moment actually required. That is what kept 2 years of careful theft from disappearing into a civil dispute that would have taken a decade to resolve. I also think about Renee. She is not a villain in this, even though it would be easier if she were. She looked away because looking away was less painful than the alternative, and that is a human thing, not a monstrous one. But looking away has consequences. Norman sat in his own house for 18 months feeling like a burden, partly because the one person who could have asked a simple question had decided not to. When she finally sat with those papers and let herself see them, something changed in her. I believe that. I saw it in her face. Whether she does something useful with that change is her work to do, not mine. Norman is back in his house now. He manages his own affairs, takes his medication on schedule, has coffee with his neighbor Ed on Saturday mornings. He called me last week to tell me about a book he was reading, something about the fur trade, very Norman, and we talked for almost an hour about nothing in particular. He laughed twice, genuinely, the way he used to. That is the whole return on investment right there. 1 hour on the phone with my brother laughing about the fur trade. A man who spent 2 years being made to feel small, made to feel grateful for scraps of his own life. That man is sleeping in his own bed, making his own choices, sitting in his own backyard when the April sun finally comes out in Calgary. It is enough. It is more than enough.